Hey, yo, everyone, gather round. It's story time. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, and the Conscious Party Productions. You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds.
Elevating our consciousness.
Changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story.
Our story.
All right. We are live with another episode of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I feel very honored and blessed to be joined by Dr. Kris Clarke, all the way from Finland. How are you this morning, or this evening for you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great. Just still kind of waking up, got my coffee going, but going well.
Good.
How's the weather over in Finland this time of year?
It's dark and wet. We're still struggling into possibly some spring at some point.
Yeah. Well, it's usually really snowy where I live, and there is some snow, but it's been raining all winter, and I don't know if that's a combination of global warming, just an off year, or whatever the case is. But there's a ski resort behind me, and they've been making a lot more snow than they've been getting. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's definitely been a very warm winter. I don't remember. I've lived in Finland now for, 25, 27 years, and I don't recall a winter this warm and wet.
Yeah, well, let's start there. You're originally from Fresno, California, right?
I am a proud, what would we be, Fresnons? Yes, I'm from the Central Valley of California.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about that. How do you go from Fresno to Finland?
Well, my parents were from the Bay Area, but they settled in Fresno, California, which is in Central California, so it's an agricultural area. It's also a very interesting place because you meet people from all over the world there, because agriculture is one thing we all have in common. It is the territory of the Yokuts people. And, I bounced around quite a bit. When I turned 18, I left Fresno and I moved around. I was curious. I wanted to see the world. So I lived in Oregon. I went to Howard University for a while in Washington, D.C. Actually, Kamala Harris was a year behind me. I went to Wales and went to college in Cardiff during the miners' strike of the 1980s and ended up coming back to the States. But I was working in the restaurant business. I was a bartender for a while, and I just wanted to do something different. So I sent this is the day when you still wrote letters with stamps, and I sent like 15 applications out just to get an English teaching job somewhere, and Finland was the first place that answered. So I went there, and I'm not Finnish. I'm Irish American, but I've been here on and off since 1985.
Oh, and so did you get your social work degree while you were in Finland?
Yes. So my degrees were in English literature originally. I love literature. I think it's some of the best ways to learn about social work is to read novels. And I came to Finland working, and then I ended up joining a master's course here because I was here on a 1-year contract to teach English in a small school, and met some people from the African National Congress when I was there, and realized that they were going on to do a master's degree in international politics and development studies. So I went home and saved money, and then I returned and joined that course with them. So I have a PhD in social work, but I'm not a clinical social worker. I don't have an MSW.
Well, and I teach in the spring, I teach Human Behavior in the Social Environment, Part 2, Person and Environment. And we've adopted your book. I always forget the name of it for some reason. I always want to call it Decolonizing the Mind, but Decolonize Pathways toward Integrative Healing and Social Work. And that's with one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Michael Yellowbird.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, I was at a little seminar in Vermont, and I opened the door at the seminar, and I actually tripped over him. He was sitting on the porch, and I apologized and said, I'm heading to go have breakfast before the seminar starts. So if you'd like, I have a rented car, and we could, you're welcome to join me. And we ended up missing the seminar because we sat over breakfast and talked for about 4 or 5 hours. And we just kept up the conversation. We kept in touch, and there was so much to learn from Michael. He came to Fresno several times, and, we started doing what we called retreats. So we'd get community members and students and interested people, and we'd have a theme, and then we'd spend 2 or 3 days together talking. We did theater, we did drumming, we did lots of different things, but they were really moments when you had people together to really kind of feel that collectivity, and then also really discuss from the heart, because we're often so trapped in these matrix of time, and there's no time, that they were really wonderful events. And the book came out of those retreats. I think we did 5 of them altogether.
Well, it sounds like the universe aligned for you two.
Yes.
I always appreciate those kind of stories. Well, the book, one thing I like about the book, obviously for being a professor, is that it's open source. What made you all decide to go open source with it?
Because it should be for the people. I don't agree with books being behind a paywall. And luckily, Michael was able to find funding for that. But we absolutely, and we're working on another book right now. I don't know if we'll have the funding to put it open source, but I'm a strong believer that, knowledge is about sharing. We pay taxes, and taxes go to grants or are distributed in different ways, and that the knowledge and the fruits of all of that should come back to the people. So anyone should. We wanted to write this book so it would be accessible to anyone, not just in terms of open access, but that it would make sense, that it could be readable for people and not hidden behind jargon or big words that don't just say what you should say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like with the way that universities still deal with textbooks is kind of archaic, you know what I mean? Because there's so much information. It's 2025, you can gather and curate information in a number of ways. And so to force students to buy textbooks is,
right.
I mean, I know everybody has their reasons, and I guess some books may be necessary, but I really appreciate that. So thank you for making it open source. And it's like Monica, one of my students, says thank you. She appreciates that as well. One of my favorite parts about the way that you two wrote the book is that I think each chapter begins with some storytelling.
Yes.
And I think for me, that's what it's all about. You mind talking a little bit about that?
So we wanted to, again, a lot of what we learned from these retreats was, we had all kinds of people who came to them. So different generations, people involved in different ways, in different issues. And there was a lot of storytelling in these retreats as well. So we wanted to open up the chapter kind of with an example, but not kind of a clinical case study, but something that would speak about what we were trying to say in the chapter. So that was really the impetus, because I think that both of us, both Michael and I, have had different types of experiences, but we would often meet and chat and share these stories with each other. So I think it's a fundamentally human, throughout the world, a human trait is to share stories. And I think that's what it's about. And we could add the literature and all the main points after that, but we wanted something that would encapsulate kind of the point that we were trying to make in each chapter.
Yeah. And another thing that bothers me about higher education in these days is, for example, I teach mostly online asynchronous courses, and you lose that essence sometimes of the ability to do some storytelling from the professor side, but also from the students. If you had a physical classroom, obviously it depends somewhat on the way that the teacher facilitates the class, but there's always an opportunity to talk story and share things before class, after class, and the discussions and things like that. Essentially, a social work class on online asynchronous could end up just being the banking model of education, me giving you a bunch of stuff and then giving you a paper or testing you on it. And there's really no opportunity for students to tell their story or to share their wisdom or knowledge. And I'm a big believer that everybody comes to the classroom. I'm not just a teacher. I learn, each class that I teach, I learn more and more each time. And so what I've been doing is facilitating optional voluntary talking circles a couple times a week where students can come on their own. And we just have, we check in with each other, and then we just have a very basic talking circle, which I learned from Alaskan Native elders, but it's very basic. Just, we don't have a circle. So I'll just make a list and everybody can share whatever's on their heart. They can unburden their heart. I'll give them some talking points, but they can really talk about whatever they want. And I've just been very, very heartened, and it fills up my heart almost each and every session that we have, because the students show up for each other. They're authentic. They share their wisdom, their stories, their knowledge. They learn from each other. If we go late, they stick around and support each other. And I was just wondering, what kind of methods do you use as a professor?
But thank you for sharing that, because I absolutely agree with you. And that is the best thing about this job is being able to participate in these kinds of discussions with people, because I always walk away from a class feeling I learn more than from my students often than whatever material I had. I try, here in Finland, I've had some very big classes. So sometimes like 100 people, and people from different countries, because I teach in English sometimes. And I've always looked at these big classes and thought, like, we can't have just a lecture here, because there's so much here to learn from each other. It would be a shame to have someone from Spain sitting next to someone from Ukraine, and they don't have a chance to discuss. I do a lot of, and this I learned from Deborah Sexton, a great anthropology professor back home. She had this method of co-facilitation. So when I have readings, in each group, one person has the responsibility to facilitate a discussion. So let's say I have 2 or 3 articles I ask people to read, or a chapter or something. Then the co-facilitator kind of opens up what kind of discussion they want to have about the material, and everybody can kind of chime in. So in that way, instead of just lecturing about it, people are prepared, because you want to show up for your colleagues and be able to discuss with them. But it also allows some creativity to take the discussion in the way they want to with the material, and the discussions can be quite different. I also sometimes ask people to bring artifacts into class and talk about them, like bring something that represents the future to you. We use, different, I'll do maybe a core lecture for like 15 minutes or so to kind of focus, like, what are the main points? But I try to challenge myself to support students in having these opportunities with some structure. So we're still kind of moving on with the focus, but that they have an opportunity to really discuss and to share. And so I have assignments also, like writing a cultural autobiography. Think about yourself, your own culture in that sense, and share what you want to share. You don't have to share, but that which you would feel comfortable disclosing with other people. So, and a lot of it, Fresno students, taught me a lot about this because they were so willing. Finnish students are a little quieter sometimes. You have to do some work to warm them up a bit. They're kind of like, they'll sit and watch you for a while before they speak. So, you have to really kind of make it a comfortable spot.
Yeah. I get the same experience with many Alaskan Native students. They're a little bit, I don't know, and I don't want to generalize, but sometimes you just got to take a little more time and build up trust, and they'll speak when they're ready. And I guess that goes for a lot of different students.
Yes.
Well, what do you enjoy teaching about as a social work professor?
It's changed over the years. So I think what I really enjoyed, I taught 13 years in Fresno, and I've been back here in Finland for about 6 years. So in Fresno, I really enjoyed community social work a lot, because we got out of the class. It was easy to get out of the classroom and go places. We do walks in the community. We were active with different community events and different activities. I was also many years involved with HIV, different projects in Europe and in the US. So, students organized informational events. And, I always appreciated the enthusiasm of Fresno students. So teaching about community there in the macro practice class we had, that was really great. And I always admired how students in California, like, really could, organize stuff and get things going, Finland, the curriculum's a little different, but I enjoy classes on diversity. It, of course, is filtered through a different cultural experience here, a different geopolitical situation and all of that. I really enjoy the big classes also with a mix of students, because you just learn so much. I do a lot of like research seminars as well, and it's always exciting to see what people are enthusiastic about. And it's about being open and learning, lots of different things.
Yeah, you mentioned a cultural autobiography, and we do a similar assignment in my intro to social work class. But I'm curious on how you like to get students to think about or to write about their own culture. Oftentimes, when you're dealing I can't speak for Finland, but here in the United States, if you ask some people about their culture, it's going to be very general. It could even be, what kind of cereal they like or what their favorite sports team is, and then if you go deep, maybe like what religion they were born into their family, things like that. Very general. And I think that culture is much more nuanced. You know what I mean? And I'm just curious on how you get students to think about that and write about that in an effective way. And maybe you can also touch on, is there some differences there in Finland about how folks think about that?
I always give kind of a long list of prompts of things to think about, like tips, maybe family of origin, maybe not. Maybe your virtual community gives you a lot in terms of your identity or how you see your culture, different notions of, gender diversity, or, are you a migrant, how many generations are you indigenous to this land, these kinds of things. I think in Finland, the difference is, Finland became independent about 100 years ago. So it's a relatively kind of new nation in that sense, but it's had kind of a homogenous sense of identity. And part of this was to survive as a nation. Finland has had kind of a similar experience as Ukraine, in World War II. So there's been this strong force of homogenizing. But of course, Finland as any nation, is very diverse. The only indigenous people in Europe live in the north of the Sami people live, and it stretches from Norway through Sweden and Finland over to Russia. So Sami land's been kind of cut up. So there are indigenous people, Roma people, even differences among Finnish people from the east and west. And so some of it is here, when I talk about that assignment, is trying to encourage people to kind of trouble that homogenous story that has been so strong. And I think also in Finland, I would say in the last 15 years, there's been a lot more research and thinking done about colonialism and how has Finland been complicit with colonialism, even though it didn't technically have colonies, and even though it was in some ways colonized by its neighbors. So looking at these really complex relationships and trying to nuance culture and identity within that, going beyond these dominant narratives.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the book is obviously about decolonialization, decolonizing the mind, things like that. I think one of the things that I hear from some of my students is kind of a tension and a frustration, especially specifically from some of the white students. And I've been through this before. I think I went through this, maybe a decade ago or more. But you hear people talking about certain things and you're like, well, when are they going to talk about me? Or you think, where do I fit into this? Or even if you're talking about something like community, where you're talking about the indigenous value and relationship to community, and they're saying, well, that's not my fault that I haven't experienced that and I don't have that. And there kind of becomes almost a wall, I think, or something, or a barrier, I would say. And I think I like to let students work through it themselves and just keep talking about it and dialoguing about it. But I'm wondering what you think about that, and if you've dealt with that very much, and like in response to the book.
Certainly, certainly, and I think these ideas about discussing diversity is kind of new-ish in Finland. And yeah, when you have privilege, you don't really have to think about these things, and I think that's the hard thing, is to confront, to really think about, it's not fair that I have to think about these things. But then the other thing you have to think about is, like, other people, have had to deal with these issues all the time. So, part of it is just coming to terms with the structural injustices that we have, in society. And you have, some of it is also going beyond the individual. You have to see that, what is my purpose here? Is it to just allow these structures to continue, or do I do my small part, to try to challenge these structural injustices? And I think, nobody is the discussion is not about blaming individuals, or like, your grandfather was like this or that, but it's about, what are you going to do here now, and how are you going to contribute to a more equitable society? And yeah, it might mean you have painful myths that you have to let go of, and there might be a process of grief that you might feel that, I imagine my life like this, or I always thought about my country like this, and now I have to, deal with a maybe more ambivalent, ambiguous, complicated legacy. But that's, the reality we live in is not an either or binary, good and bad. It's complicated, and I think, despite everything, like, being engaged in these issues will give you much more than just, trying to deny and not hear them. But I understand that it is hard for folks sometimes to think about, your privilege as a man, or your privilege as a straight person, or your privilege as a white person, or, why your passport means you go in the fast lane and everybody else is stuck, needing visas to get, the world is not fair, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, and another thing that comes up oftentimes is in the United States, obviously politically you have Republicans and Democrats, red and blue, oftentimes, I say almost all the time, in social work, especially in social work over here, they're going to lean left, and they're going to align with Democrats. And if it's Harris versus Trump, it's Harris is good and Trump's bad. And I think sometimes we get lost in it, like you said, it's kind of like this, that there's only two sides, but it's much more complex than that. And what do you think about that? How can we navigate that and be a little bit more nuanced politically in social work?
Yeah, well, I think now, if any time, people have to be political and not be afraid to be political. And I don't mean that just in the sense of party political. I don't just mean, parties are important and all of that, but we have to be political in understanding our ethical obligation to stand against genocide, to be on the side of those who are facing the most challenges in this life. And whichever political party is going to be the one delivering that kind of, agenda is the one that we need to be pushing. And to be honest, I think every political party in the world can use some pushing at this moment, because we're in a world that is far more inequitable, unequal, and unfair than when I was younger. Even Finland, in the 20, 30 years I've been here, has become a much more unequal society. And so this is, some of this is about the values of relationality, the value of, sharing. These are not complicated things. And we need to be present in those discussions where they are talking about the nuts and bolts of how money is distributed, or which programs are going to be supported. And that means we do have to be political. And if there is a political party that's going to support that, great. But everybody needs to be pushed who's a politician. All of them, some a bit more than others. And it is a very dire moment, I would just say, globally, because we are seeing the rise of fascism. We are seeing genocides occurring in the world. I mean, if ever there's a moment to raise our voices as social workers, this is the moment. And so we should not be afraid of being political, and not to also get into that typecast of you're on this side or that side, but, having a strong ethical voice about, children, the safety of children. We've seen a genocide where there's never been so many children killed in Palestine as we've seen in the last year. And this is a child welfare issue, whatever people's politics are, and the same with Ukraine and so on. So we should not be shy about standing for moral values.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing these things up. And I always, whenever we get in on the podcast, whenever we get into talking about, say, Palestine, I got to take a deep breath. And I think it's one of the things that I've been, disappointed and disheartened about politically in the United States of America, because ultimately, both sides were supporting that to at least some degree. And
Right.
And I think in social work, sometimes when we align with a political party or something, sometimes it allows us to overlook, or to
Right.
be in an echo chamber. It allows us to overlook those things. And when we're thinking about, like, let's say, just undergraduate students, they come in all shapes, sizes, and ages and all of that. But oftentimes, folks are pretty disconnected from something like that. It's hard to know about what's going on in Palestine or Gaza, or to really understand. And there's a historical context and everything. It's a lot to take in, right? If you wanted to really learn what was going on, you'd have to read 10 books and have tons of discussions. It's not something that's simple. And I think back to my time, when I was an undergraduate, and I was old. For a student, I was 30 or so when I started, and I didn't know about those things. I'd hear certain names of other countries that we were bombing, or this or that was going on, and it just really didn't register to me. I didn't have the background for it. And so I wonder what you think about how to, get students, or anyone really, but students involved and thinking about those things. Do we start by decolonizing our own mind? Do we do that with, in a combination of learning about these issues? And I think it can also feel helpless, right? Like, even me as a professor with some power, I feel like, what can I do about something that I feel so strongly against, but it feels, powerless almost, to a sense.
Well, I think one thing is recognizing decolonization is a process. It is a process that we're always continuing on, and looking also back to ancestors of people who have struggled with civil rights or women's rights or the anti-colonial movement throughout the world. But that these are many of the same struggles, have deep roots, and we should be continuing them, and we're ignorant by design. It's an educational system that keeps us not knowing these things by design. And so it is important to educate ourselves, whether it means, you're listening to a podcast, or if you have time to read a book, or participating in ways that you can to learn, talk to people. But there's a lot of folks from around the world living in different places, not necessarily by choice always, but because they've been thrust out of their countries due to conflict and poverty and famine and these. So I think, engaging with people, being connected with people, but then also understanding, it's about doing your bit, and don't be disappointed if, you don't change the world in with a certain action. When I taught community social work in Fresno, a lot of what I thought was important as a social worker was to learn about, for example, like zoning laws, for example. So why is our neighborhood, why are we struggling a lot? Why do we have so many liquor stores in our impoverished neighborhood? Well, it's zoning laws that are creating this environment, or allowing these landlords to continue to have substandard housing. Sometimes it's finding that local issue, and through that, it will also open up a certain vista on the world where you see how relations are. So it's, it is about, lifelong learning, I think, always being engaged, always being humble, but being engaged, being connected with people, and no issue is too small. You look at your neighborhood and try to understand, when you see injustice, why is it so? It's a bigger world of it. It's all interconnected. So I think now one thing about the internet and about podcasts and whatnot is there's such opportunities now to listen and learn from people. So take advantage of it, and then find that thing you can do.
Yeah. Well, that's a good time to kind of segue. You have a podcast called the Social Work Roots Podcast. You mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yes, so I have a graduate student. I have some PhD students, and I have a wonderful student from Ghana named Priscilla Osei, and she's very talented with, I know nothing about technology and all of this. And during the pandemic, we just started this podcast. And what I wanted to do with that podcast was to diversify stories of coming into social work. So because we were, in Europe, we were kind of stuck in our apartments, I just started calling folks mainly. I started out talking mainly to people back home, people I'd worked with in the Valley and so on, and just asking people's life stories and what had been important to them and what social work had brought to them. And it was really interesting. And then we've talked to some international people. Now we're starting to talk to some authors about their books. But Priscilla has also, on my website, she's just put up a wonderful page about Black scholars in Finland. So it's just been that kind of decentered thing. It's been podcasts, but it's done some other things as well. A lot of fun, though. I really enjoyed listening to people.
Yes, mine started at the university as well, and I didn't know what was going to become of it. It was just an idea at first, but I mean, it's been an incredible experience for me. I mean, what I would, if my younger self, to think that I'd be talking to folks in Finland, all over the world, and scholars and, people that would have been way over my head at some point and still are to some degree. But Dr. Yellowbird, for example, I just almost walk away from some of these conversations like, wow, I wish I could just continue talking for days because there's so much there to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been incredible.
Yeah. It's all about connection. I mean, in the end, it's about connection and conversations with each other. The more connected we are, the more we empathize with each other. Children understand this. And I don't know when we separate ourselves more, but the more I think that we are connected and we empathize, the less we can tolerate or accept unjust structures. It's just that basic.
Yeah. And I think you said that very well. And I think that's my experience as well. I think I remember when I was an undergraduate, maybe like a sophomore or something, my second year, and we went to, which I'm not sure what they called it, but I would assume that today they'd call it an anti-racism training. Mm-hmm. And I remember there, and it was a Filipino guy talking to us, and he was very animated and very into what he was doing. And some of what he said, I took in and I registered with, but a lot of it, I was just kind of very resistant and disconnected. I didn't feel like I was a part of it. And then unbeknownst to me still to this day, I don't know how this happened. I think I just applied when you mentioned earlier, applying to all sorts of places, and I was trying to get involved in the university and didn't really know what to do. And so I applied to all these different programs, and one of them I think was the Rural Human Services program. And I got a call one day and they invited me, and I was up living in a Inupiaq town on the Arctic Ocean. And so the Rural Human Services program, what they'll do is they'll bring folks from rural Alaska, almost exclusively Alaska Native, but there's a few others that straggle in like me. And I went there, and at first I was the only non-Native person, and I was the only male. And that changed a little bit as we went on. There were a few more people that came in. But I went in there and I was like, wow, these folks are not going to want me in here. This is a different experience for me. And it was, they facilitated almost everything, all of the learning by talking circles. And it was a big group. So like 30 to 40 women were in there and me. And I remember the first talking circle that I was a part of, I was thinking, I've got so much other stuff to do and people are talking for so long. And I felt like people are kind of whining and complaining. And I'm thinking, what does this have to do with me? And I think even I was one of the last ones. And when it came to me, I was just like, I don't know what to say. I'm hungry. Let's have lunch or something. And the thing that happened, though, was that over time, participating in the circles, for one, they were very gracious and hospitable to me and very welcoming, almost the opposite of what people might fear, like I said, that I feared might happen. But also was that when everybody is sharing stories and you're listening, and you can't help but listen if you're there for so long, but if you're bored, eventually you're going to pay attention because you're bored. And I became a part of it. And instead of it becoming like my story and these ladies' stories, it was our story, and they were intertwined. And I realized I played a part in it, and we became very, very well connected. And it planted the seed for, a transformation for me. And I realized everybody doesn't have that opportunity. And you mentioned, it's important to be connected and whatnot. And I think today we can be more connected than ever, right? We can have this podcast from Finland to Alaska, and I have students all over the globe as well. But on the other hand, oftentimes we don't know our own neighbors. And I think one of the negative things that I think is maybe unintentionally sprung out of like DEI or anti-racism is that there's a fear of getting to know what we deem the other, or that we're going to be wrong or this or that. And so it might prevent us or instill a fear in us to talk to somebody else or to get to know them. And so instead we use our imagination, and which is often wrong. And so I wonder, what do you think about how do we stay connected, or how do we get connected in this, futuristic world that's ever changing, and who knows what's coming tomorrow. But I think as social workers, especially, it's so important for us to stay connected, but it can be so difficult.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Yeah. I think one of the things too is learning not to police each other necessarily. I mean, it's one thing if we disagree, or you want to express like why that hurts me, and we have to assume the other person has a good heart and wants to hear that as well. That's not always the case. But I think sometimes fear prevents us from connecting with each other. Fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of, and I think one of the next steps we have to take is, I found in those retreats with Dr. Yellowbird that one of the things was that people were able to, there was an atmosphere so people could open up and speak. And it doesn't just drop down. It is something you have to work on to create those trusting bonds. And definitely in those retreats, I learned a lot about people who maybe had very different backgrounds from me. But I think some of this connection means that we have to, try to overcome that fear of like talking to people who are very different than us. And of course, I say that like still fully recognizing that we're in a very hard world right now, that where people are throwing Nazi salutes and there's a lot of violence, and it's not always wise to approach people who are trapped in these cycles of hatred. I fully recognize that. But I think, our hope has got to be in finding some way to discuss also with people who are not like us, or who maybe don't always have the same viewpoints, and to try to listen, because I do think, we talk a lot about polarization here, and how has the world become so polarized? How is it that we cannot speak? And I think the only way to start overcoming that is by speaking to one another, fully recognizing that there is a core of people that maybe that tactic is not going to work with. But I do think in person somehow, one of the legacies of the pandemic, has been that it's been hard to somehow get people back together. That there has been kind of a trauma through that pandemic for many people. And it's been difficult. I know even here in Finland, it's been hard to get people back in the classroom and back together. So I think being patient with one another, and finding ways to there are things that make us uncomfortable, but we still have to find ways to deal with that discomfort and connect with each other. I don't see hope unless we're able to somehow find ways of connecting, but it's difficult, and it's deeply uncomfortable, and it can be painful, and I'm not going to deny that. But yeah, and classrooms are wonderful. If people have that opportunity to discuss in groups, I think that's a great way. Even, I read a lot. I read a lot of fiction, and I think some of the best writers right now are coming out of Ireland. There's some just wonderful novels coming out from rural Ireland about people. I just read a book about a young man and how his sense of feeling trapped in this rural. And I also felt like this really opens the world and made me very empathetic to young men who might be experiencing, these kinds of feelings and this kind of life situation. So also, novels are I think, great way to learn. You fall into someone else's story, So I think those are some of the ways.
Yeah, I think, and going backwards a little bit, I think you see a lot of males in the United States, white males, but all kinds of males moving right. And I think part of that is because they don't know where to go. And I think sometimes they feel chastised by one side and embraced by the other side. And so we've got to find a way to have more grace with each other and allow people to be wrong and to, work with each other through those things. That's one thing. But I meant to ask you this earlier because you mentioned using novels and fiction. Do you have any recommendations? I'm sure my students would love that.
Yes, I really enjoyed this book called Wild Houses. It just came out, and it's from rural Ireland, and it is it deals with that sense of being kind of adrift and with nothing going on for you, and still it shows the small connections people have. And I'm just looking it up right now. I also really enjoyed a book by Belfast writer Michael McGee, Close to Home, which was a wonderful book about young men dealing with trauma. Northern Ireland was a place where there was a conflict for many, many years, and actually it has some of the highest rates of PTSD in the world because of the conflict. So it's this next generation that's growing up now and dealing with that and not having a lot of economic opportunities and trying to find a masculine sense of yourself in a world that's not always welcoming or giving a space to you. So those two books I've really enjoyed recently. I also, last recommendation would be Heather McCalden's wonderful book, The Observable Universe. Heather's parents died of AIDS when she was young, and it's a very interesting meditation on how do we remember things, and it deals with the internet. She grew up in the 90s. We don't write letters anymore. There's not artifacts necessarily. So I'm very interested also in how we remember social memory, how memory can be a form of activism, how going back to history sometimes can give us a guide to the future.
Yeah, and that brings me, I had a student submit a question, and they were asking about, they're saying they noticed in the book talking about memory work, and they said it was a new term to them. You mind talking about that just a little bit?
Absolutely. And that's something we're writing about right now with Michael Yellowbird. So memory work really kind of became big in Europe in the 1990s. And it was kind of a response. Part of it, there was, feminists, and then there were official historians who were looking at these official histories we had and trying to look at what was missing from them, and then thinking that maybe these histories or memories don't necessarily just come from historians, but live in the community. So people did different events, sometimes with theater. We did this with Michael when we were in Fresno. We had a very skilled theater person who did this kind of, what was it called? It was like theater of the oppressed. So everybody participated together. We kind of co-created, went back to important memory of our people in different ways and created stories together. She also worked with the Hmong community. It's people from Laos, Northern Vietnam, and had grandchildren work with grandparents to do a play about the history of the people. So it was going to people and looking at what kind of memories were in the community. Sometimes they were repressed memories, and doing that kind of work to see what that memory meant to people and how could that be kind of a beacon for the future. So it's a little different than history, where you're trying to kind of give a linear narration of the facts. Memory work is what do we take from the past that has made us who we are and how it changes, and how can that give us a vision for the future. So, for example, my grandmother was an Irish immigrant. I'm an Irish citizen. But our views of what Irishness is would probably be quite different because they're rooted in a similar collective memory, but from different times. So memory moves and changes and engages with the present. But it's, what we bring from the past is also, it changes and it gives an idea of where we want to go to the future. So it's always dynamic is what I mean. It's not just like this happened in this year, And one way I got engaged with that, I was teaching a class, and it was right when the wall fell, the Berlin Wall fell. And I had students here from all over Europe. And we started talking about World War II, and I realized like everybody had a different like collective memory of it because we came from different countries. And I'm thinking like Band of Brothers, I'm thinking like my great uncles were in the war, my grandfather was in the war, all this kind of stuff. And it's a very different story if you talk to someone from Russia or the Baltic countries or France or Japan. Or so the memory we carry with us is that core of history, but it shifts. And so memory work is something you can do collectively within community in different ways. And it's a good way of orienting towards the future. It's bringing your dynamic identity into the future and giving a view from your people in a way. And so it's not separate, but it can overlap with other people. Because of course we've all been interconnected. When I talk about decolonization, I mean, one of the things I think about is I am a product of colonialism. My people came from Europe to the United States. So I am a product of it. Colonialism is me, So when I think of decolonization, part of it is that memory work of how would I like to see a decolon? What is that process of moving there? I can't stand separate from it. I am part of this process. So how do we change it? And of course, Ireland has a complicated history because Ireland was colonized. It's where the first plantations were. So, this is a thing. It's all very complicated, very interwoven.
Yeah.
That's a long answer. Sorry.
No, you're good. It's funny because I think Dr. Yellowbird had sent me a video recently talking about Ireland and colonization of Ireland and trying to draw some parallels. And I really appreciative of the way that he looks at things.
There is just to interject, there is a rap band called Kneecap, which has come out of Northern Ireland and uses the Irish language. They just had a film come out and they really deal with themes of decolonization. So it's fascinating to see young men who are probably in their 20s, working towards language revitalization, because that's also a key part. You need your own language, you need to maintain that. And talking about these themes and what does it mean today to 20-year-olds in Belfast. So, memory is dynamic. History is dynamic. This idea that time is simply linear and you mark it off like a clock and then you're done is not really how nature and the world works. We live in seasons.
Yeah, and it can be hard in today's world, right? Because not very long ago in human history, we consumed most of the stories that we know from our grandparents, from that were passed down, and then in the modern world, your grandparents might be working still, and probably both your parents are working, and you're in front of the television, you're in the school, which obviously can be propagated. You have propaganda there, and we kind of get cut off from those things, and so our stories become the advertisements and things like that. A couple things that have helped me is one, just kind of cutting some of those things off and consuming less of that and being more mindful of what kind of things I do consume. But I grew up in Utah, and so most of my family, at least, got to Utah via the LDS Mormons, the Mormon Church, in a variety of ways. And while we're disconnected from it today, they keep excellent genealogical records. And so I'll go on to their website and pull up a family tree, and it changes from month to month because people are still adding things. But people are putting stories up there, and they're recording oral stories of people from the past. It's helped me significantly to fill in gaps because we don't talk about those things on either side of my maternal or paternal side. They don't really talk about the things. They've been cut off. There might be a few stories here and there, but it's really filled in gaps for me. And then, spending some time in meditation or even before bed, trying to think about things as I'm going to sleep and see what I can get. It's really connected me. And I've realized that I am a part of that story, and I can kind of recall upon those memories. It may not be the clearest thing in the world, but it's almost given me a sense of connection to the past and responsibility for the future. Often think about how can I instill this in my children? And I guess it's through my own, fostering a sense of storytelling in my own family. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And I would just say, also, many of us have had different types of families in the sense that, even if it's not your biological family, but whoever has raised you or whatever group that you feel akin to, to have a broad sense, because I want to recognize also that people don't always have a good relationship, or maybe we're not able to have for various reasons. I do think people have a curiosity. I think children have a curiosity about these things. And one thing I think is trying to maintain these stories and traditions. I have boxes of letters and things from my family here in my closet. And, one of the things I want to do is get down to also writing and preserving these different stories of, people also that I have connection with. But I think it's very important to try to keep stories. I mean, like that Project StoryCorps. I don't know if you've ever followed it. It was a wonderful project, and you can find it. I used to use it a lot with students back in the States, students online, and they would have a trailer, a small place, and dim the lights, and they would have two people with a microphone, and you would have something like 20, 30 minutes. Someone would interview someone else, and somehow it was such a sacred type of space that people talked really deeply about their lives. They'd have grandchildren maybe asking, what was it like to be in the war? Or, a sibling asking questions like, how did you feel growing up in this type of household or whatnot? But I think having more of these opportunities, it's also very healing, to listen to these stories, whether or not actually they're even your own. But we, this is what memory is made of, is these infinite amount of stories, and then stories of resilience or challenge. And it does give us tools, because I always try to encourage my students, don't be afraid to fail. Don't be like, and okay, I failed like a million times. You pick yourself up and maybe you take that road instead of this road. But I think listening to stories of elders and ancestors gives that kind of strength to overcome, even these times that we're living in right now, which do feel kind of dire, to be honest. One thing is knowing that people have survived really difficult things and still had a sense of grace and kindness. I mean, if you think of people in the civil rights movement who had water hoses turned on them and dogs biting them, and were still able to treat each other with such love and loving kindness and grace, that is something to aspire to, a kind of peace. Looking at Leonard Peltier walking out, he did not walk out of that prison in anger. He walked out with love for people. And that's something that we can all work towards, that despite injustices, and it doesn't mean that we should give up on striving for justice, but also recognizing that loving kindness will take us far. We don't want to become that oppressor and that hateful person.
Yeah, well, very well said. And you brought tears to my eyes a little bit, bringing up Leonard Peltier, because I didn't think they were going to let him out. I didn't think that Biden, I knew for sure Trump wouldn't. Yeah. I didn't think that Biden would, but he did. Yeah. I criticized him for not doing it, and he did. So I'll give him credit for that.
He should have given him a full and complete exoneration, in my humble opinion. But all right, the main thing is that he is out. These kinds of things, these injustices, but they do not make us stronger as a country.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I've been taking up a lot of your time, and I see that there's some things going on in the chat. So do you mind if I put some stuff in here from the students? And if you have a question or a comment, feel free to drop it, or there might be a little time to call in if you wanted to. But Kimberly said, thank you, Dr. Clarke, for your encouragement for us in these turbulent times, to connect, show empathy, and use our strong ethical voice to stand for moral values and to find the thing that we can do. Yep. And Miriam says, love your comment about the more we are connected, the more we empathize. This is so true. Just this week, listening to videos about mental health in prisons made me realize I hadn't even thought of that. But now I've been thinking about those issues. And that's a good point. Sometimes we don't even know anything about things. And so we have somewhat of a responsibility to learn. We can't learn everything all on our own, but by being curious and searching, and having some good teachers and professors that put it out there for you. Olivia says, sex education appears to have been deprioritized. And I wonder what your opinion is on the underlying factors contributing to this trend. with addressing the challenges of implementing HIV education, particularly among individuals from conservative backgrounds or various religious and traditional belief systems, and stigmatized discussions around sex education, what strategies can be employed to enhance sexual health education and effectively dispel prevalent myths within a highly sexualized culture? Are there significant differences in the teaching methods used in Finland? Is there a book that you would recommend?
Yeah, so Finland has had sex education in schools since the 90s. And one of the things that's different about this system is young people, I think starting at the age of 14, have a right to attend a clinic without parental knowledge or having to have a consent. Having said that, we also have one of the lowest rates of abortion in the world. So knowledge is a tool to keep people safe. We have low rates of teen pregnancy as well. And that much, having lived in Finland, I'm a great believer in education and care, offering, young people a safe place. But of course, it's different. Like the dynamics are quite different. I think in the US, this has become like a very, very hot topic in many ways. I do believe very much that young people need to be informed in a factual, clear way, not just about mechanics of things, but also about the emotional aspects, learning things like about, partner violence, intimate partner violence, and these things at a young age is really important so that kids learn their worth from, and their ability to consent and their ability to make their own choices, and what intimacy is about from a young age is very important. I think it's challenging in the States because you have counties and states and things are very heterogeneous depending on like where you're located, and I know at least in California, HIV education was completely defunded in 2008 with the mortgage crash, which has resulted in a higher rate of HIV, for example, in my hometown, and a lack of knowledge, and it benefits no one, in that sense. It's a really hard, a challenging thing to discuss, I think, right now in the U.S. because these issues have become so weaponized against queer people, against gay people, against women. But I have to believe that trying to organize and discuss on these basic levels of, we want safe, healthy families of various sorts, that there's got to be ways of organizing around that and challenging or finding alternative spaces. I mean, during the AIDS epidemic, it wasn't like people were welcome. Anita Bryant was busy stigmatizing people and the CDC was ignoring the virus. So people organized their own ways of education. But this has become, we're in a real challenge with this fundamentalism right now. And I respect all, spirituality, but I do think like there's certain issues. And one is children have a right to know their self-worth and their right to have their own wishes and to not be touched in ways they don't want to be touched, or not have violence. And sometimes they need to be educated in tools about that. And also, what does it mean to be close with someone, have a relationship? So it's not just about the mechanics, but it's about the whole package. And I don't know, like going back to history, if you think of the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, that was written expressly to fill a need for women, for the lack of information about our own bodies and things like that. So I think healthy activism might be the best way. I think schools are really hard right now due to the situation, but looking at it also in broad sense, because, for example, HIV, there was a study once done in Los Angeles, and it found that women who were not able to pay their own rent, meaning that they had to be dependent on someone, were more likely to be infected with HIV than women who had the ability to pay their rent. So it's a complicated thing. It's also about, your right to bodily autonomy, and can you exert that right? So it is in a bigger complex. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thanks, Olivia, for the question. We've got Anna who says, I recently got into a conversation with another person about Disney changing portions of their movies to be more politically correct for this time. We then got into how this could be changing or ignoring the past. What do you think of changing, past books, movies, history Is it erasing what we've done or accepting that we were wrong and that it can be changed now?
Yeah, I haven't watched a Disney film in a while, I have to admit. So I don't know the changes. My grandchild's too, so we haven't really gotten there yet. I always think it's about context. I really do believe like it's about interpreting in context, and that looking at certain artifacts and things from the past, you have to explain the context of that. And it is perhaps in some ways good to understand that this was everyday entertainment. And so how did that instill these types of attitudes in people? But it is about interpreting, and it is about giving a context. And I think it's really hard to just do these either we show them or we don't show them. Like I remember watching Mad Men when it first came out some years ago, and I said to my mother, I could barely watch that first episode. I was so angry at how secretaries were treated. And she said, that is how it was, my dear, when I was young. And I really had to think about it. And then because I found the first season just hard to watch, the casual comments towards women, the complete erasure of racialized people, ethnic minorities, but then having that context, having discussed that, I thought like, okay, it probably was quite accurate and for a point, but you do need the context. Otherwise you just think like it's normal, and that's about communicating. Like we should watch films together and talk about them. That's what we did. Like when I was a kid, we'd watch like All in the Family, which was like just radical at the time because you should go back on YouTube and look at some of those old episodes of Maude and All in the Family, because they were really, I was watching one the other day and I thought like, wow, they dealt with some tough topics back then. They're not so different than the conversations we're having now, actually.
Yeah, and I think, Disney puts a disclaimer on the beginning of films, and I guess they've become more diverse in these days. The Little Mermaid's much more diverse than the one that they did before, but they'll put a disclaimer. And I don't think that does much for me. My kids aren't going to read that and they're not going to understand it. What would make a difference is me talking to them while sitting down and watching it and saying like, hey, look, the way they're portraying the Indians or the Native Americans in Peter Pan, we need to talk about that.
Yeah.
Father of young children, I'm watching a lot of shows, right? And sometimes I'll pull up an old show on YouTube or something that I like, and I'll see it and I'll be like, oh my gosh, I didn't remember that they portrayed folks this way. I had no idea. And so I wonder, what did that do? What did that plant into my brain, into my consciousness that I had no control over and had no idea about? You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Even I remember there was this Big Bad Wolf cartoon, Disney cartoon, just a short one, and with the three little pigs. And I was researching a little bit, and it was originally the wolf was a Jew, and then they changed it to a wolf to make it more appropriate. Just things like that. And, Peter Pan with the Native Americans. And it's interesting how far that went, because you remember the movie, The Never-Ending Story?
I never saw it.
It's a fantasy film, but it had like they're fantasizing about Indians, about Native Americans in the thing. And it's a German film, I guess is my point. So it's interesting how far the reach is. But I think that, like you said, we need to just talk about them. If you have children, you don't have to hide it, but talk to them about it and talk about why it was that way. And that's the best that we can do.
This is part of the memory work, and because you can also tell stories about how people were oppressed. This is part of the memory. If you want to give tools for people to understand things, then you have to, talk about why things were different, and also how things have changed, how people challenge, because changes didn't fall from the heavens. Changes came because people challenged. The social work has courses on diversity and oppression because there were scholars who challenged the whiteness of the curriculum, and we could still argue there's a long road to go. But there were people who have pushed things so that we are where we are. And that's also part of the story, that while we might be impatient that we're not yet in a decolonial world, it's quite different than it was 20, 30 years ago. When I was young, domestic violence was something like, well, it's a family issue. It's not a police thing. Like, just stay out of their business. Think about now, that would not be acceptable. So there has been change. And we always, like, when we think about how overwhelming and awful things are, always remember there's been a lot of change for the good as well. And we have to hold on to that, you know, things do change. The way we talk about things is quite different in 2025 than it was in 1975. So it's hard when you're in the middle of it to see that incremental change. But when you're an elder like me, you can look back and say, yeah, there are a lot of things for the good that have changed. A long way to go. Always long way.
Long way to go, but conditions have changed dramatically when you really look at it if you go back in history. All right, let's get to a couple more of these questions. Jade says, I enjoyed your comparison, and I don't know how to pronounce this, of clusters Garrowin, is that right? To the heavy metal music as a war weapon. Trauma can shut down the verbal communication sometimes, but using creative arts can open up communicating and creating healing pathways. How did your research process lead to finding how heavy metal is also a form of colonialism? What has caused pain can also heal. How could we start to incorporate creative arts into social work?
That's a great question. And I'm trying to remember exactly. I remember I was very interested in sonic landscapes. It's been a few years since I wrote the book, but I was just looking at that too. Like, what did the indigenous world sound like? We always think in different ways, but we don't think about like the sound and also, how all of this like noise, also imprisons us. And just I was very interested in writing that chapter about just, my brother listens to he's very musical and listens to a lot of, he's very sensitive about sound, but what is noise and what is, what is soothing, that's something that I was really thinking about. What one person's noise is another person's community, for example, and I'm a real believer that creativity is one of the most healing of all interventions that we could do, whether it's art, painting, or storytelling, or writing stories, or that in creativity, playing music or whatever it is, that's where we can get into that kind of a flow zone of healing the brain. Neoliberalism is, I think, in some ways had a bad impact on social work because it's made us look at like, this is the intervention, this should be the outcome. And we look for a straight line between the two. You do this and this will happen. And instead of, sometimes there are things you can't measure. Sometimes they're just good things to do, like taking a walk in nature or learning to play the harp. Or these can be profoundly healing types of interventions, though you might not be able to measure them. And part of the thing is decolonizing our mind, or trying to challenge the coloniality of this way of always measuring. There's a competency, or there's an outcome, or there's an intervention. It's good in some respects, in some ways, but it should not imprison us from also realizing, we use so little of our creative brain these days, and that's so sad. Children don't have time to play anymore. Play is, even with the adults, play is one of the ways that we free up, we become creative. I play with my dog and okay, that's an idea. Go out in the forest here and come up with ideas. So I'm a real believer in creativity. And, that's one thing in Finland is there is a great belief here in arts and creativity, being a small language group. And I think that should be something that we never skimp on. And we don't always have to look at disciplinary boundaries, Literature to me has always been very important. I think reading is a very creative act because, you have to kind of go into imagine the characters and go into that space of even watching a film. I watch a lot of international films, and you're watching a film about Hong Kong or something in the 1960s, and it transports you. You become empathetic. You look at someone else's grocery store and the trouble they have with their love life or whatever, and you're just like, okay, like we're human, So I think that there's many ways, but one of the first things is challenging how narrow we've allowed social work to become. and we should not accept that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the way that you put that. Social work has become narrow. I think in a lot of ways we've broadened social work, but in many other ways it's been reduced to like a commodity and a profession, and with rigid guidelines on how things are to be done. My perspective has always been that social work is an art, and
Yes.
each person that's practicing it should be able to be their authentic self, and that's going to be different all over the place. That diversity, allows opportunity for real growth between the practitioner and the client or whoever we're working with. We're missing out on that, so I hope that we can make a turning point in that regard. All right, Kirsten says, regarding your HIV/AIDS advocacy, I feel as an adult the stigma has changed a little bit with the advancement in healthcare and medications, and the commercials especially help a lot. However, I am not familiar with what the advocacy work looks like or how it can be improved. How does the stigma impact advocacy social work, and what strategies have been the most effective? Have you seen the stigma change over time?
Definitely. I mean, in the early 90s, it was complete, total stigma. People were shunned if they were HIV positive. And I was that generation, so a lot of people I went to high school with and so on passed away from AIDS. But I moved to Finland in the 80s, and I ended up in AIDS advocacy, HIV advocacy here through a European Union project. And here it was what we were really looking at, because we had, national health and all of these kinds of things. What we were looking at was the intersection of migration and HIV. So sometimes, there were people who were coming to Europe and coming to Finland who didn't know they were HIV positive because they had maybe been assaulted on this long journey that they had to take fleeing the country, or for whatever reason. And then they faced two stigmas. One was being an immigrant, maybe being racialized as different than the majority of the population, maybe not also having secure immigration status, and then being diagnosed as well with HIV, often very far from family. So we worked in AIDS and mobility on those issues particularly, and a lot of what we worked on was trying to develop capacity within migrant communities to develop appropriate information appropriate for their communities, but then also working with policymakers, because people might have very different viewpoints. They might not have the security to know if they could stay. So if you're going to start on medication, are you going to get to keep taking the medication? In Finland, often the most common reason back in the 90s was that you would have women often from sub-Saharan Africa who had very difficult journey here who would find out they're HIV positive at a maternity test. So of course, very traumatic as well, but trying to find that kind of support, and people who might be more socially conservative to talk about these issues than perhaps like the gay men cohort that we had here in Finland. So like trying to also deal with people's different feelings about talking, about education and so on, and complexities within community. Like you don't want your small community, you don't want people knowing your business. And so all of those kinds of things were a little bit different than I think in the States in some ways. At the moment, I'm working on a history actually of Fresno, California during the AIDS epidemic, and looking at how social, because Fresno, California is a rather religious place, and it's very socially conservative in many ways. So when the AIDS epidemic started, you had people who were reluctant to talk about these issues. First of all, you had a lot of stigma, but there were doctors and nurses and social workers who really came together to create a very holistic, wraparound, wonderful program for people. And we've done 60 interviews so far just to learn about the courage of these people to advocate and create this type of service in a place where there was really no finances, very few resources, populations that didn't have much money, that were super diverse in many ways. It's really a tribute, to these nurses and social workers and doctors that they were able to step up and create these things. So people do. If you read Rebecca Solnit, she wrote a wonderful book about disasters. And we always think that when there's a disaster, everyone's like, oh, and they want to kill each other. And actually, no. The true history of disasters is that people come together in a crisis. It's afterwards when we start getting, all these complicated involvements in organizing where things often, kind of go off the rails. But the immediate thing is usually people try to help each other. There is that kindness in people. And we see that in the AIDS story in Fresno for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks, Kirsten, for the question. Alice added, when we were talking about Disney, I think Disney in particular has instilled a negative self-image for women for the last 75 years, and any change away from that is a good thing. And, that's something as a parent of two young girls. I've got my oldest daughter turned 6 yesterday, and the other one's 5. And they're, especially the younger one, the 5-year-old, she's really into princesses, and other people jump on it, grandparents and things, and they send more stuff. And it really irks me sometimes. Grandparents are being grandparents. I'm not slandering them. I just mean that the things that she'll say sometimes about, getting married, and it's just these things that are princess type of stuff that's so unrealistic and so disconnected from our reality. And it's hard to talk to talk to our children about it, and I try, but it can be difficult. And so I agree with you, Alice. It's, that idea of, because essentially what it's saying is that your worth as a woman is going to be tied to marrying some kind of prince, or some guy's going to come around and rescue you. So I agree with you 100%. And
yeah, it's hard to, socialization comes from more than the parents. It comes from schools and media and so many different things. And it is hard. I'm all for princesses of whatever gender and whatever, you want to wear bright clothes. That's great. But it's, that kind of Barbie, the body image stuff, and this idea that your self-worth only comes from, having a certain partner, often of a certain social class. But you're in it for the long term. So, you just keep planting the seeds along the way, that's the best way.
Yeah, absolutely. Alice added one more comment. She said, I can also speak directly to the lack of good education for youth in America. I thought I was a very open, educating mother, but as my son has reached young adulthood, I am actually horrified by his sexual safety knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, again, I think the issue is that it's not rational. I mean, one thing about Nordic welfare states is they tend to be very rational, like a harm reduction approach to stuff, so there's drug abuse, so we have a needle exchange. And that was something we fought about a lot in Fresno. It's like, no, we can't, because people will want to start using drugs if we have, and of course people are doing that anyhow. But yeah, and I think it's challenging right now. There's certain things that are very challenging, like Andrew Tate and this kind of misogynistic stuff that's being spread along, social media. And I think it is something that really needs to be taken up, especially for young men. That book by Michael McGee, out of Belfast, the one that I can't keep forgetting the name, that's exactly what he's talking about, the close to home. He's exactly talking about these boys that grow into young men who really, are not having an identity or something of themselves, and only learn that, through, and same with Wild Houses, drinking culture or, violent culture, fighting in this stuff. There has to be alternatives offered. It takes work by the community to really be inclusive. And sometimes, I've seen here in Finland that there's often, I worked a lot in immigration services here, and there really wasn't a whole lot for young men. Everyone wanted to save the girls, and that's great. I'm all for save the girls and stuff. That's great. But also there's boys, and they also need, stuff that they can do, and ways to learn to be vulnerable, ways to learn to be intimate, ways to learn, because a lot of all of this stuff is a reaction against, not feeling that you're safe enough to admit that, because you're not supposed to. So rational knowledge, I'm a great believer, like know yourself, know your bodies, get in our bodies ourselves for boys. And second, like, let's find ways to also be inclusive of young men. Like I say, these Irish novels are often about, I think they're written by the author themselves, about how a young man got out of this culture. But it is looking at this lad culture, this young men culture, with a lot of sympathy for why things are like that. We have to do better.
Yeah, find some sense of healthy masculinity. I think masculinity can be very positive in boys and men, but not if you're following whatever his name is, the Tate brothers. And they actually surprise me, and I don't know that much about them, but it actually surprises me that so many people follow them, because they seem so outlandish from my perspective. And why would, I don't know, I don't get it. But I guess that's another conversation for another day. One last thing I wanted to mention to you was that obviously with the oncoming, or not the oncoming, but the rollout of the Trump administration and their, aversion to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that there are reasons why there's some pushback that have been overdone in that regard, but their pushback on it is even further over the top. And just in the last week, I've received 2 letters. One was from the federal government telling us that we had 2 weeks to change things like any kind of preferential treatment to any kind of groups or anything like that. We don't do that in the social work department. It doesn't affect us, but how forceful it was. And they put up like I don't know what you call it, a snitch hotline, a tattletale hotline.
Yeah.
And then we got one that was just passed on to us from administration at the University of Alaska, that to comply with the administration, that we had to scrub any kind of mention of diversity, equity, and inclusion towards, I can't remember what they said, like equality, but it was the same thing. It was a threatening, you got 2 weeks to scrub it off any website, scrub it off any, printed propaganda or printed publication materials. And I wonder what's going to come next. But I think, I get students that are texting me and emailing me about it, like, what do you think about this? And what are we going to do about it? And is it just going to be against the rules? And for one, I don't know how you say that, like saying the word diversity is a bad thing, for example.
Yeah.
But I think about resistance, and how do we resist these things, even in our small ways. I can't go and tell Trump to stop it and get him to do that. But, from my perspective, and I'm a white guy in a position of, at least a small position of power, and, I'm going to do me either way. And so it doesn't change anything about the way that I do things. But I wonder, what do you think about ways that students and everyone else, how can we resist it in little ways, even if it's on our own consciousness or in our own little programs? And I realize there may be bigger issues, people losing jobs and complete programs being taken away. But what do you think about that? What are the ways that we can resist?
Yeah. I mean, this idea of censoring books and telling you what you can say and not say, of course, is the stuff of dictators. It's what Stalin did. It's what Hitler did. And, these are not interventions by a healthy democracy. So first of all, remember that none of those regimes lasted, so just for perspective, which is not to minimize that this is awful and it's terrible and it's shocking and it's unbelievable. I don't have words for it watching it from over here. It just seems like the point is even not just about being anti-diversity. It's about resegregating. It's about erasing, all the things that have happened in the last 20, 30 or more years. And that's the thing, is you have to recognize, like, it's pretty powerful what has happened in recent years if someone has to ban talking about these things. So one thing is to recognize the power of what is, all that has been accomplished, and that this is the moment where it might seem like the maximum strength, but this will not last, is the thing to remember. That it might feel overwhelming at the moment, and certainly people are paying a terrible personal price. I don't want to minimize that. People are losing jobs. They can't pay their mortgage, their rent, all of that. It's true and it's awful. But I also look at this as profoundly weak. Any government that has to ban things is a weak government. If people can't look at things, it's weak. So that's one thing. But I think, part of the problem, I think, with DEI was that it could be seen as a very neoliberal way, like about individual identities. And we've got to find our collective. We can have diverse collectivities, but it can't just be about our individual selves. It has to be more about discussing collectives and communities and people together. So I could see that critique of how DEI could be, just used as individual slotting identities. So with all social movements, with all things that have moved forward, there are ideas that are tried out, and then you learn there's pushback, and you learn how to supersede them. And I hope that we can take this as a moment to resist and realize that we can reimagine and get maybe to a more decolonial space, because I think we have to go beyond DEI to really look at the coloniality of systems that are wrecking our lives, wrecking the world. It's not just about a social identity. It's about the whole way that we've learned to think about ourselves and other people, way that we've learned to think about resources in the world, about sharing. It's so much deeper and more profound. So working towards that critique and resisting in all small possible ways that don't put you at total risk unless you're ready to take that risk. I think in all ways, we have to continue this, and remember that this will not last forever. This is kind of the last gasp of segregationism that's trying to push people back in the closet, push people back in, the segregated housing. And honestly, I do not believe the majority of American people really want that. Now, we can argue about ways that we've discussed things and ways that we've organized things, and we can come up with new ways. But I really have my doubts. I mean, I still remember that, Trump won by about 1-2% of the vote when you really look at it. So this is not a resounding, huge, push. We are in a time of absolute change. This is today is the third anniversary of the war starting in Ukraine, of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Definitely here in Europe, people do feel that this transatlantic alliance that has persisted since World War II is reeling, is not stable. And so we are in a time of real change. But with all the headwinds, it's up to all of us to try to contribute the way we want to see the world, and what are our fundamental values, and what do we want for our children and grandchildren and 7 generations down. We have that opportunity in whatever way we can to resist this. But I just want to say and remember that a strong regime that knows its worth and the justness of its words will not need to ban books.
Absolutely. And it's so contradictory to some of their own messaging. And I think also with DEI is that something that the left, or whatever we're calling, the opposition, can do is self-reflection and look at the ways that we missed the mark on implementing ideas like diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, decolonization, all those things.
Yeah.
Because where there's so much pushback, oftentimes there might be a nugget of truth
100%.
in there, and it's worth some self-reflection and critical self-reflection and evaluation into how we can move forward to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that we made this last time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is all about self-reflection. It's always about, growing, and it's okay to make mistakes. Let's make something better. That's the goal.
Well, Dr. Clarke, it was a pleasure talking with you. And just as I mentioned to you when I talked to Dr. Yellowbird, I felt like there was so much more that we needed to talk about, and so much deeper that we can dive on a number of issues. But I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time out for me, for the students, anybody else that's listening. And I hope that we can stay connected and have future conversations, hopefully move into a different world, a better world as we go into this future. And
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to all the students. And I hope, just Google me and be in touch, because I'm always here and I love to connect with people. And, I always think of the words of Arundhati Roy, the great Indian writer from India, who said that a new world is being born. And on a quiet day, when I'm really quiet and I listen, I can hear her breathing. So that's what we have to do. There is a new world coming, and there's all that opportunity for us to be more connected, more kind to each other, and have a kinder world. But it will only come if we work towards it. And also that means cherishing those small moments of going out and looking at a tree, like the new leaves on the birch tree, or the birds flying, the murmuration above your head. And, so there's moments of joy also to appreciate in this struggle. That's what ancestors did. That's how we got this far. And it's our turn now to lead through this very dark moment.
Very well said, and a great note to end on. Thanks again, Kris, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you all. Thank you, students, and be in touch.
All right. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.